Hi everyone. We're going to start off today's lecture on community ecology by watching a video of a hyena that has killed an impala and is trying to feed on it. This video was taken during my study abroad program in South Africa recently. And what we see is initially the hyena has the food to itself, but shortly after some vultures come in and find the hyena with the food, and those vultures then proceed to harass the hyena, trying to get the hyena to drop the carcass. Community ecology is the study of how species interact and how species live together in a community. We have 4 key learning objectives today: identifying and explaining the 4 types of ecological interactions within a community, describing the fitness effects of these interactions, then describe how the 4 conditions that are required for a trait to be selected for are met when examining ecological interaction, and finally describe how interspecies interactions can drive evolution of both species, and that's called coevolution. So to start off with, we want to define the concept of a niche. So once we take an organism and we place it into a community, and we're no longer looking at just an individual's population, we want to know what the niche of that organism is. And the niche is essentially the range of the resources used and the range of conditions it can survive in. So it would be looking at the prey species and the habitat, or the food resources that an organism uses, or the types of soil it can grow in. So I want to look at the puma as an example of something with an amazing niche. All right, the puma ranges from southern Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And you can see this enormous range that the puma has. And it occupies the niche of a large predator in all of this, but throughout this range it eats different foods and lives in different habitats. So in the Rocky Mountains, it will live in the mountains and feed on bighorn sheep and marmots. And then in the rainforests of Central America, it feeds on small pigs called peccaries and small rodents called agoutis and pacas. And down in southern South America, it feeds on a large llama-like creature called a guanaco. So it has a pretty amazing niche. And we're going to look at what happens then when the puma is in an area where there are other predators present that might be feeding on other things that it likes to eat. So what we're going to look at here now with our understanding of niche is this interaction called competition. So these are 4 interactions that occur, and competition is the one that we're going to focus on initially. So with competition, you might think of intraspecific competition, but that's really the realm of population biology. What we're curious about here is interspecific competition, which is the competition between species. Intraspecific is within a species, interspecific is between species, and this is caused by niches overlapping for organisms. So if we were to look here, these are 2 species and the seed sizes that they consume. You see minimal niche overlap here. And so these 2 species would experience very little competition, whereas 2 species that had higher degree of overlap would experience much more competition. So we're going to look at 2 concepts with the niche: fundamental niche, which is the resources an organism will use when there's no competitors present, and the realized niche is which an organism uses when there are competitors present. And if we think about the puma, it has that incredibly large range, but in some areas of its range, it is not the dominant predator. The dominant predator in Central and South America, and a lot of that area, is the jaguar, and the puma cohabitates with the jaguar. So if we look at fundamental niche versus realized niche, and we have the green area being the range of resources used that the puma would use, the larger shape there is its fundamental niche, the larger bell curve, that's the green solid line. If we take the jaguar and add that in, and it has this purple solid line that as the range of resources that it uses, what we find is that when the two species occur together, the stronger competitor will force the weaker competitor to adjust its niche. So in the absence of jaguars, pumas will exhibit this fundamental niche where they will feed on a very wide range of species. But in the presence of jaguars, pumas have a much smaller niche and feed in specialized areas and on specific species to avoid competition with the stronger competitor, the jaguar. So with any of these species interactions, we want to think about what the effect is on species A and what the effect is on species B. And if we think about this, we could have two species, and if they do overlap, what's going to happen to those two species? So species A and species B would not stay in overlap forever. They could have either niche differentiation, which results in them having minimal overlap in the resources used. And we see this in three species of hawks that live in Michigan here. This one illustrated here is a Cooper's hawk. If we look at the three species of these hawks that live in Michigan, we see the American goshawk at 21 inches in length, the Cooper's hawk at 17 inches in length, and the sharp-shinned hawk at 13 inches in length. And so we could ask the question, what's going to happen as far as food that they use? They all feed on small birds. And so will the goshawk eat any of the birds that it can find? The Cooper's hawk only eat smaller ones, and then the sharp-shinned hawks eat the smallest ones? Or will they all be opportunistic and feed on anything? Or will we see that goshawks only eat the largest prey, Cooper's hawks eat intermediate-sized prey, and sharp-shinned hawks eat the smallest prey? Now we need to remember that they can't really completely overlap, right? So if the goshawk ate the complete wide range of prey species, and the sharp-shinned hawk and the Cooper's hawk ate prey species within that curve, it's likely that one of those species or two of those species would be driven to extinction of the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk. Now what we find when we look at this is that goshawks tend to feed on larger prey species. So they'll feed on things like grouse, woodcocks, and doves, larger prey species. Cooper's hawks will tend to feed on things like robins and blue jays and red-winged blackbirds. And sharp-shinned hawks will feed on things like sparrows and warblers, including our beloved golden-winged and blue-winged warblers. Now, you can see different things happen when you have this interspecific competition. What we talked about there was niche differentiation. We can also have kind of aggressive behavior between competitors where two competitors, one will try to drive the other one out of the area, and this happens with lions and cheetahs. It also will happen with jaguars and pumas. And we can also see that where species overlap and compete, like the blue-winged and golden-winged warblers, that you could have competitive exclusion, which we might be seeing in these two species, where the blue-winged warbler is now becoming more common than the gold-winged warbler, or there may be niche differentiation, and scientists are still trying to figure out that question for these two species. Now we're going to look at examples of competition now from intertidal zones in the oceans, and look at how species occupy specific ranges of habitat. Okay, so if we look here, we have out of the tidal zone, we have things like periwinkles and rock louse. And when you get to where the high tide zone is, you start to see still those periwinkles. You see limpets, you see chitons. As you go below the tide, or into the middle tidal zone, you see different species coming in. You see still some chitons and limpets, but not as many. You see other species like barnacles. And then as you go to the low tide zone, you see another group of species. And this implies that there is niche differentiation going on. So as we think about a niche, remember the niche is the position occupied within an ecosystem It's the resources that they acquire and how they interact with other species and the habitat that they live in. And you can see that in the intertidal zone, there seems to be some niche differentiation. Now we could look at this and think about this kind of hypothetically. If we had this situation where species A can occur below the intertidal zone and species B could occur both above and below the intertidal zone, there is some niche overlap here. So if we look at this, then we could ask the question about what happens to the fitness. Now, if they are going to compete directly, then it will result in lower fitness for both, and that's what that minus is when we have competition. That's the fitness effects of the interaction. Now, we could also see niche differentiation, all right? And this would be where the two species separate out their niches based on one being a stronger competitor and one being a weaker competitor, so that species B then only occupies the areas outside of the zone that species A likes to live in. So this is, again, our niche differentiation, another example of it. And we see this a lot in intertidal zones. The other option would just be competitive exclusion, where species A, being the stronger competitor, starts to exclude species B, and eventually species B will go extinct. So those are two possible outcomes that we could see when we have interspecific competition, and we want to look at this as we think about competition and see which of these is actually occurring. We'll return to the blue-winged and golden-winged warbler case throughout the semester, and we want to be thinking about that case with regard to what is actually occurring in those two species.